course. That's an honor. To have you here. Welcome to the second day of this workshop. We're going to start with Reier Helle. No, with Reier Helle. I'm going to pretend I can pronounce that. The presentation called What is to be Stoic? Reier, thank you very much for being here, for sharing your ideas with us. Please continue your presentation.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Leonardo, and thank you all for having me here. I also want to thank Ricardo for putting on this and organizing this great event. I'm very happy to be here and to talk about what it is to be a Stoic being with y'all. So a few preliminary remarks before I get going. As some of you already noted, there are two handouts. It's been suggested to me that this was really a ploy to reduce the size of my handout. Be that as it may, the long one is the most important one. I put the Greek text on the second one. So this is a true work in progress. I mean, I find that sometimes people say that when it's really an extremely polished piece, whereas this is something I'm trying to work out. As you can tell from the title and abstract, if you looked at that, I mean, this is pretty tough stuff. I am pleased to say that I think I have made some progress on this question, and that it is, in fact, possible, I think, to make some progress on this question. Nevertheless, I do want to say that the reason for the relatively dense and long main handout is that the way I've proceeded here is by going through a lot of different evidence, because there are no texts that just explicitly tell us the answer to this question. And I also want to note that in the last section of the talk, so section 5, it is quite a bit more speculative even than the rest, and I'm particularly keen to hear your input on that. Okay, so secondly, I'm going to be speaking throughout of Stoic ontology and the Stoics and the view of the Stoics. I mean, this is common practice, but I do want to signal that although I'm not going to be arguing for this explicitly today, I do take it that the views I'm going to be ascribing to the Stoics in this talk are in all likelihood Chrysopian. It seems to me most likely that the views I claim to uncover here were at least first precisely formulated by Chrysippus. Naturally, much of this will have been continuous with what Zeno and Cleanthes said about the same topics. How much, it's hard to tell. How much is refined and modified? Again, hard to tell. One general indication that this is likely to have been Chrysopian is that I will be relying on some general features of the full fourfold scheme of the categories, which is correctly in my mind widely ascribed to Chrysippus. Okay, so let me start by just going over what I take to be fairly uncontroversial key claims of Stoic Chrysopian ontology. We have covered some of this already. Let me just be fairly brief. The most general determination in ontology is something, T. We can say that everything is something, and every something is either a being, on, or a non-being, me-on. Claim B, all and only bodies are beings, onta. C, every something that is a non-being is a subsistent, hyphestos. And D, alongside and outside of the somethings, tina, there are not somethings, utina, such as universals and possibly fictitious entities, which are neither beings nor subsistents, but quasi-somethings. So, of these three, I take D to be a bit more controversial than the others. Nothing much in my talk hangs on whether you agree that this is part of Chrysopian ontology. I tend to think it is. So just by way of illustration, I've given here on the first page of the handout two key texts. So the first is from Sextus. The Stoics say that of some things, some are bodies, others incorporeal. Then they list 4 species of incorporeal: sayable, void, place, and time. And from Sabius, they say that concepts are neither somethings nor qualified, but figments of the soul, which are quasi-somethings and quasi-qualified. These, they say, are what the old philosophers called ideas, for the ideas are of the things which are classified under concepts, such as men, horses, and in general all the animals, and other things of which they say there are ideas. The Stoic philosophers say that there are no ideas. So for us, there are just 3 points I want briefly to note here. The first is that though the Stoics are committed to a strong kind of corporealism, and the relevant kind of corporealism here is what I've put in claim B, all and only bodies are beings. Despite this, they don't banish non-bodies from their ontology. We have the incorporeals, and we also have the possibly shadowy not somethings. Secondly, I take it that the beings, the bodies, hold some kind of priority over the non-beings and the non-bodies. The nature of this priority and this dependence is highly controversial, and it is an extremely difficult matter, as you all know very well, how to do this in the case of the different incorporeals. Third, I just want to briefly comment on the status of this T, something. So, of course, it's a good question. What is it to be something for the Stoics? Now, I'm not going to try and answer that question because that is scarcely, if at all, easier than the main question of my talk today. However, I do want to just offer a couple of remarks to indicate to you what my general line of thinking is. So the first is, I take it that to be something is to be an individual, and the relevant way of being individual is, my thinking anyway, first to be an appropriate object of deixis, and secondly, to be determinate, fully determinate in a certain way. And we can appreciate the relevant kind of determinacy by comparing something to not something like the universal human being, which is neither a Greek nor a non-Greek. And this kind of lack of determinacy or incompleteness might seem problematic with a view to whether something is something. So the idea is that any something is determinate in precisely the way that a universal like the generic human isn't. Okay. So, with this framework in mind, here are the questions that I'm interested in today's talk. First, and now on top of page 2 of the handout, why is it that all and only bodies are beings on the Stoic way of thinking? And secondly, what is it to be a Stoic being? So a few notes on these questions. We should expect question 1 to have an answer that at least makes contact with the thinking of opponents of claim B. So people who are opponents of the claim that all and only bodies are beings. It would be reasonable to expect the Stoics to have substantive philosophical arguments to back up this corporealist claim. So what's the idea here? Well, it seems to me overwhelmingly likely that from Zeno onwards, this kind of corporealism was developed in deliberate opposition to the Platonic Academy. And given the sheer striking radicality and controversiality of this claim, it would be surprising and strange to me if there were no arguments whatsoever to back this up of the sort that at least made contact with, even if they weren't convincing to a Platonist opponent. Further, contrary to certain interpretive tendencies, there is good reason to think the Stoics were engaged with the question, what is being, at least in a kind of indirect way. And notably, they did not simply identify what it is to be a body, soma, and what it is to be a being. So this is sometimes claimed in the literature, but to the best of my knowledge, there is literally no evidence in favor of it. And I don't think we should accept it. And as a result, I think we may appropriately raise question 2 and expect some kind, at least hope for some kind of substantive answer. And my strategy here is to try and find an answer to the second question in the hopes that this will help with the first question. My contention is as follows. To be a Stoic being is, apparently and at least in part, to be a certain kind of subject, hypokeimenon. Namely, a stable, determinate subject of motion. And at the very end of the talk, I'm also going to suggest that this explains, at least in part, why there can be no being that is not a body. So before I really dig into it, a few more brief notes. So when I ask this question, what is it to be a Stoic being? I don't intend this to seek for a definition. I don't think there is a definition of being a being. Certainly, there is no clear evidence to my mind that the Stoics propounded a definition of it, and there are well-known problems with doing so in any case. Instead, I'm going to claim something, what I claim is something considerably weaker, namely that by looking through certain key parts of our evidence concerning Stoic thinking about ontology and metaphysics, it is possible to uncover a kind of way of thinking about being a being. It is a question I don't address in this talk, whether that was ever explicitly set forward. For all we know, maybe it isn't. But it seems to me clear that it is detectable. Okay, so here's how I'm going to proceed. I'm going to start out by looking a bit into and going over some of the evidence concerning bodies and the extension of being. From there on, I'm going to say a bit more about being a being, and in particular, I'm going to argue that being a being is to be a subject, and specifically a subject that is stable, determinate, and suitable for motion. Last, in the most speculative part of the talk, I'm going to try and set out how this helps us with the question of why all and only bodies should be beings on the Stoic view, and in a way that might actually be substantive. All right, so first, bodies and the extension of being. Although we don't have a lot of evidence, the evidence is clear that the Stoics hold that all and only bodies are beings. It's given you two texts here, T1a from Alexander and T1b from Plotinus. So Alexander says, in this way, you could show that the Stoics don't do well to lay down something as the kind for being. For if anything is something, it is clear that it is also a being, and if it is a being, it would receive the account of being. But since they have made it a law for themselves that being is said of bodies only, they could flee from the difficulty. For because of this, they say that something is more general than it, since it is predicated not only of bodies, but also of incorporeals. And Plotinus, now perception is the reason why they placed the last first, as it became a guide for them, incredibly in respect of laying down principles and other things. For since they thought that the bodies are the beings, they next, for fear of their changing into one another, believe that what persists under them, this is the being, as if one should come to think that place rather than bodies are being, thinking that place isn't destroyed. Okay, so when the Stoics make this claim that all and only bodies are beings, what do we mean by body? So the most authoritative text on this is somewhat awkwardly from Pseudo-Galen, T2a. So why do the Stoics say that what has threefold extension together with resistance is a definition of body alone, and do not also apply to this the definition of color, flavor, taste, and every remaining attribute? So this text alone doesn't just automatically have great authority. However, in part by comparison with other texts, I do think that this is highly reliable. So in particular, if we look at T2b from Hierocles, he says that it must not be ignored that just as the body of the animal is touchable and tangible, so is also the soul, for it belongs to the kind of bodies. But this is said in the specific writings on the subject, which reveal the moves of those who talk about a strangeness of soul to be unsustainable. And by being a body, the soul admits touching and pressure and resistance and striking and impacting and everything that is similar to these. So of course, Hierocles here is specifically interested in the status of soul as a body. But what he says about body here seems to be fully general and have to do with what it is to be a body. And what I want to suggest based on this is that these basic corporeal forms of interaction set out by Hierocles are closely connected to what it is to be resistant, as mentioned in the definition of body in the Galen text or Pseudo-Galen text. The third text I want to note here is from Cleomedes. So he says that it's also simple-minded to say that if there is void outside the cosmos, it will have to be unlimited. And if the void outside the cosmos is unlimited, body too will have to be unlimited. For it doesn't follow from the unlimitedness of the void that body too is unlimited, for the conception of the void does not end anywhere, whereas in the conception of the body, being limited is directly included. So I consider this Cleomedes text to be considerably less significant and less authoritative than the other two, at least concerning early Stoic thinking about body. However, the last claim we get here is quite significant, namely that in the conception of body, being limited is directly included. This is a very interesting claim, and even if we don't just rely on Cleomedes here, we will have some indirect indications that this may in fact be right for the early Stoics too. Okay, so let's proceed with this understanding of body then, and just begin by asking, well, why all and only bodies? And here I take it is the standard, basically Brunswiggian story. And we can encapsulate it in this short argument. Premise 1, all and only beings can act or be acted on. Premise 2, all and only bodies can act or be acted on. Conclusion, all and only bodies are beings. So each claim here is well supported in the sources, and this is shown very convincingly, I think, by Brunswick. And it seems pretty solid that in some form or other, this or something very close to it is a piece of Stoic reasoning. So in particular, it is very likely, if you look at premise 1, that the Stoics were influenced by the battle of gods and giants in Plato's Sophist, accepting the dunamis criterion of being. And in fact, we are very lucky, I think, to have this little bit from Plutarch that I've given you as T3 on the handout. If you just look at the underlying text, Plutarch says, they call bodies alone beings, since it is characteristic of a being to act in some respect and to suffer. As best I could find, this is the only text that actually says that the Stoics hold this. And I think that's pretty neat that we actually have that confirmation. Nevertheless, even if there's something right about the standard story, I don't think it's entirely satisfactory. And the reason is that it doesn't really give a good explanation, certainly not for an opponent of the Stoics, why all and only bodies should be thought to be beings. The reason is that we would need, in addition, an account of what it is to act or be acted on, so poien pascein. So here are two options. First, we might say that to act or be acted on is to act or be acted on in the characteristic manner of a body. Alternatively, we might say that to act or be acted on is to act or be acted on in whatever manner may obtain when we have a true, genuine, and non-metaphorical poien or pascein statement. So the first option, which is taken by Brunswick, and which I venture to say is the most common way to think of this, would make this little more than an expression of commitment to Stoic corporealism. Because, of course, someone not already convinced of corporealism, notably Platonists and Aristotelians too, would simply not agree with this. They wouldn't agree that causation and poien and pascein is restricted in this way. If we opt for 2 instead, though, we would need a substantive story to back up, in particular, premise 2. And I'm going to, at the very end, in the last section of the talk, I'm going to show how you might get such a story. All right, so with this in mind, let's proceed to Stoic being as being a subject. There are 2 main sources of evidence that I've been using to think about the question of what it is to be a being for the Stoics. They are 1, the Stoic theory of categories, and 2, Stoic thinking about matter and prime matter. Let's start with the Stoic theory of categories. So, as you all know, the so-called categories are subject, hypokeimenon, qualified poion, somewhat disposed posekon, somewhat disposed relative to something pros ti posekon. Here are some examples. I'm now at top of page 4. So for the first category, hypokeimenon, prime matter, which is a mere subject. Qualified, animals, or the knower. Somewhat disposed, the sitting person, the runner. Somewhat disposed relative to something, the person on the right. Now, crucially for me, these are reportedly the most general kinds of being for the Stoic. Further, they are explicitly said to be kinds of subject. So here are the key texts, T4 through 6 on the handout. First, Plotinus. One could say much against those who posit 4 kinds of being and make a 4-fold division, and the subjects qualified, disposed in a certain way, and disposed in a certain way relative to something, and to posit something as shared in them and encompass all things in a single kind, since they admit something as shared and a single kind in all. For how senseless and illogical this something of theirs is, and not fitted to incorporeals and bodies. And they have left no differences by which they will divide something. And Simplicius, the Stoics in fact judge it right to reduce the first kinds to a smaller number, and some among the fewer kinds they take over in an altered form, for they make the cut into 4 kinds, into subjects, qualified things, things disposed in a certain way, and things disposed in a certain way relative to something. Just a brief note, in T4, I've supplied kinds of being for in the text. Now, that is in fact very clear in the context, but to see that, we would have to look at a much wider bit of the text than is convenient for me to give you here. Suffice it to say that it's also commonly accepted and there is no real alternative. This is what Plotinus is discussing in the context. Similarly, for Simplicius, when he talks about the first kinds, it is clear enough in the context that he's thinking of that as the kinds of being. Which is not to say, of course, that the Stoics would agree that these are truly the first kinds, given that they think that T is somehow more generic than on. Lastly, for now, Plutarch. These people alone have seen this combination doubling in ambiguity, that each of us is 2 subjects, the one ousia, the other qualified. And the form always flows and moves, not growing or shrinking, nor at all remaining such as it is, while the latter remains, grows, and shrinks, and suffers all the opposite affections to the other. And here's the key bit for us. And I've simplified their view, since they make 4 subjects in connection with each of us, and more, they make each of us 4 subjects. Now then, here perhaps it is forgivable that they come up with different kinds of subjects, but there appears to be no other way for those who are keen to preserve and guard the occurrences of growth. So what I want to do is to take this evidence straightforwardly at face value as indicating that these 4 kinds of subject were thought of by the Stoics as the most general kinds of being. So we may say then that the most general kinds of being for the Stoics, trusting Simplicius and Plotinus here, are kinds of subject. And the most general ways of being are ways of being a subject. It also seems plausible to say that to be a being is to be a subject, in some sense at work in the fourfold division given in the theory of categories. The second source of evidence in Stoic is Stoic thinking about matter. And the following few points at the bottom of page 4 of the handout seem to me to be reasonably clear. Ousia is matter, and most strictly, it is prime matter. Prime matter, which is regularly characterized as unqualified, unmoving body without shape, is the ultimate matter of beings and the ultimate ousia of beings. Prime matter is a subject. Specifically, it is the first subject, which ultimately underlies all determinations of subjects. So let's look at some texts, and I'm going to skip over T9 in the interest of time here. So first here is Diogenes Laertius. They say that the first matter is ousia of all beings, as Chrysippus does in the first book of the Physics, as well as Zeno. And matter is that out of which anything whatever comes to be. And matter and ousia are said in 2 senses, the matter and ousia of all things, and the matter and ousia of things in part. And the ousia is a body, according to them, and it is limited, as Antipater says in the second book of On Ousia and Apollodorus in the Physics. Sextus, the ousia of all beings, they say, since it is unmoving of itself and without shape, must be moved and shaped by some cause. And because of this fact, just as we want to learn who the sculptor is when we see a beautiful bronze sculpture, since the matter is unmoving on its own, so also when we see that the matter of the whole of things is moving in actual in form and order, we could reasonably inquire into the cause that is moving it and shaping it in various ways. And T10, Plotinus, those who have laid down that the beings are bodies only and that the ousia is in these, they say that matter is one that is placed underneath for the elements and that it is the ousia, while all other things are like affections of this and it disposed in a certain way, even the elements. And in fact, they even dare to push it all the way to the gods. In the end, even God is this matter somewhat disposed, and they also give body to it, saying that it's unqualified body and magnitude too. So here, I take it, are some plausible claims. Prime matter is ultimately responsible for the fact that beings are beings, because, as the first subject, it is responsible for their being subjects. Further, prime matter is ousia, and the ultimate ousia of beings, because it is the first subject responsible for subjecthood. These claims, row 1 and 2, lend further credence to the view that to be a being for the Stoics is to be a subject in some sense. So there are important and difficult questions connected to these claims, of course, among which is, how does prime matter actually play this role? So I discussed this in more detail in a different paper of mine, but it may be helpful in this context just to note that I take prime matter to be able to play this role as the ousia of all beings and to be responsible for subjecthood, essentially by being responsible for beings having corporeal bulk, onkos. So prime matter is unqualified, it's true, but it is still a body, I take it, and it does have corporeal bulk, however unqualified and indeterminate. And by so having, it is capable of ensuring that other beings are corporeal subjects by providing them with corporeal bulk. Okay. I think then, based on these 2 sources of evidence, that there's fairly good reason to say that being a being is understood by the Stoics as being a subject in some sense or other. Now, what can we say about the relevant way of being a subject? I think a few things. But before I say those things, let me just say what I've basically done here to try and proceed and make some headway on this question. So I've gone through a lot of different texts and tried to find sort of general features that are attributed to beings, especially in the context of having to do with the categories or with matter. And the idea is that, I mean, what we find here are more specific claims in more specific contexts. However, it is arguably possible to extract some more general ideas about the thinking about being, prescinding from the specifics of each case in question. And so here's what I found. There are basically three features that characterize the relevant subjects and beings. So first, stability and independence. Secondly, determinacy. And third, suitability for motion and change. Now, crucially, just a caveat, when we talk about subjects here, we aren't talking about mere subjects of predication. This is important because incorporeals can also be subjects of predication. So a place, an incorporeal, may, for instance, have a certain size and magnitude. And what we seem to be talking about instead is a certain way for bodies to be subjects. So a bodily kind of subjecthood, namely more specifically for change, kinesis, prevailing qualitative conditions, so skesses, and qualities. Okay, so let me just summarize some key points about each of these features, and then we can look at some texts. So stability and independence, and I'm now at page 6 on the handout. So prime matter is unqualified, unmoving, and unchanging in itself, to which and in which all change, differentiation, and qualification occur. It is a stable base for change, differentiation, and qualification, which depends on nothing for being what it is. The idea here being that its stability as a subject for these various differentiations is in part why it is supposed to be the ultimate ousia for things and an indication of what being a being has to do with for the Stoics. That's the thought anyway. The more specific kinds of subject are apparently differentiated according to stability and independence from most stable and independent, qualified things, through less stable and independent, things disposed, to least, things to somehow disposed in relation to something. Now, determinacy, being determinately bounded and individuated as one thing in contrast to other things, is described specifically as the effect of the cause responsible for being, called ani. Second, non-beings are distinguished from beings by not being limited or determinate on their own. Even prime matter is described as limited. Lastly, suitability for motion and change. Prime matter ousia is regularly characterized as unmoving and unchanging in itself and as a suitable subject for change and motion. The kinds of subject are individuated, at least in part, by which changes they may and may not undergo. And each is understood, it seems, in part by reference to a certain kind of change. So mere subjects by reference to quantitative changes, qualified things in relation to qualitative changes, things somewhat disposed, dispositional changes, and things somewhat disposed in relation to something by reference to relational changes. Lastly, all of the items for which beings are said to be subjects, so motions or changes, qualitative conditions, and qualities, they belong to a subject on a Stoic way of thinking in virtue of the subject being in motion. And I've given you some references for this last claim in footnote 6. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the texts. And there is a pretty large amount of evidence behind here. And what I've done is try to give you a kind of illustrative snapshot of this. So first, T11, Plotinus. Perception is the reason why they placed the last first. They said that matter is ousia. As it became a guide for them, incredibly in respect to laying down principles. For since they thought that the bodies are the beings, they next, for fear of their changing into one another, believe that what persists, this is the being, as if one should come to think that place rather than bodies are the being, thinking that place isn't destroyed. So this text, I think, nicely reports precisely the kind of reasoning we would expect from someone holding that prime matter is ousia, the ousia of all beings, namely that this is to ensure that there is a single stable underlying subject, which persists through changes. Now, T12 is a report from Simplicius about 3 senses in which the Stoics understand the term qualified, poion. The important point for us is how the report presents the Stoics as linking different kinds of subject with stability and comparative instability. So this is what Simplicius says. They speak of a qualified thing in one sense as meaning anything according to a difference, whether it should be moving or held in a condition, and whether it's in a condition supposed to be difficult to destroy or easy to destroy. And in this sense, not only the wise person and the person holding out their fist, but also the runner is qualified. And they speak of a qualified thing in a second sense in which they no longer encompass motions, but only conditions of holding, which they define as that which is held in a condition in accordance with a difference, such as the wise person and the person with his guard up. And they introduce the third, most specific sense of qualified, in which they no longer encompass those held in an unstable condition, and the person holding out his fist and the one with his guard up were not qualified, according to them. So the third and most specific sense that we're given here is the sense at work when we talk about the categories. And we see here that it is described as stable, whereas the others are not. The source of the stability in the case of things qualified in the third sense is presumably that here and here alone, there is a quality that ensures that the relevant way of being qualified sticks around. The first sense that we get here matches the third kind of subject, so pos ekon, things somewhat disposed, and it includes things in motion, like the runner, and things held in a condition, like the person with their fist up. And the second sense, the things in motion drop out, and finally, after this, we get to the third and most specific sense, when we leave out things that are unstable, comparatively speaking. So my suggestion, and what I want to do with this text, is that this is yet another indication of how the Stoics think of subjecthood, i.e. as somehow concerning stability. Moving on to determinacy, top of page 7 on the handout. And I've given you 3 texts here. I'm only going to read out the Simplicius T13b. The Stoics posit a rarefying and compacting power, rather motion. The compacting motion moving inward, the rarefying motion moving outward. And they think the former is a cause of being, the latter a cause of being qualified. So this pretty well-known text is concerned with the cause responsible for unity in ordinary unified bodies. So it's concerned with the tensile motion of pneuma, by which pneuma is supposed to sustain bodies like animals and plants and inanimate natural bodies like rocks. And so it is concerned with a specific case. Nevertheless, it is significant, I think, that the effect of the inward motion is described as to enai, as being. And at least in part, what is going on here is that holding together and sticking together with a determinate boundedness is in part what's going on. That in order to be, in this case, a more specific being, but nevertheless to be in the relevant way, is connected to being determinate and determinately bounded. And I think that T13a and c would also back this up. Now, lastly, suitability for motion and change. So I've given you 2 texts here, T14 and T15. And what they do is show how the Stoics link different kinds of subject to being able to persist through certain changes and motions, and others not. And so to being suitable for certain changes and motions, and others not. The second text from Simplicius illustrates the more general point that they seem to individuate and distinguish the kinds of subject, at least in part by reference to how they're able to change and not. So this bit from Plutarch on the growing argument, we have already looked at, but just briefly, these people alone have seen this combination doubling in ambiguity that each of us is 2 subjects, the one who see are the other qualified. And the former always flows and moves, not growing or shrinking, nor at all remaining such as it is, while the latter remains, grows and shrinks, and suffers all the opposite affections to the other. So what I think, I mean, this is a controversial text, as you all know, but what I think Plutarch is referring to here as ousia is taking the relevant person, for instance, Socrates, as being a mere subject. So being mere corporeal bulk, essentially. And taken in this way, which corresponds to the first category, there is no growth because quantitative changes are destructive. Whereas when we talk about the second category, that's completely fine. Because here, what is important is, by contrast, qualitative changes. Now, if you look at T15, this is further backed up, I think. So this is from this long passage where Simplicius talks about the fourth category. The Stoics say that relative to something, pros T, are those things which incline towards something else by being disposed according to their own character, while some are disposed relative to something, pros T pos ekonta, are those things which naturally belong to something and not without change and alteration in them, together with looking towards something external. For the son and the person on the right are in need of certain things from outside for their subsistence, and that is why, even though no change has occurred in them, there would turn out no longer to be a father when the son has died, nor a person on the right when the one next to them has moved. But the sweet and the bitter would not come to be different unless also the power in them were to change at the same time. So, if things somewhat disposed relative to something change in accordance with the relation of something else to them, even though they have in no way been affected, it is clear that they have being toenai in the relation alone and not in accordance with some difference. So, I think this text not only indicates that relatively disposed subjects are understood by reference to certain changes, it also suggests that qualified things like the sweet and the bitter are connected to qualitative changes. And this is, of course, at least on my picture, exactly what we would expect. Okay, so here's my suggestion based on this evidence and these texts. In general, to be a Stoic being is to be a stable, determinate subject suitable for motion. This is abstracting away and putting this together, the sort of synoptic picture that we seem to get from looking at these texts. This may be further specified according, for instance, to degree of stability and suitability for different motions, and such specification yields different kinds of subject and different ways of being. So this is what we saw, for instance, in the Simplicius text about the different ways of senses of qualified. Now, importantly, the general characterization here, I think, is to be taken as a unit which determines a certain general way of being a subject. So even though it's a complicated description, referencing stability, determinacy, and so on, I intend this to be taken as a single way of being a subject, which may be varied in different aspects. All right. We are closing in on the end, the last and most speculative section. So I want to return now to my first question from the beginning of the talk. So why are all and only bodies beings? And in particular, why only bodies can be beings? And there are two parts here. First, does this understanding of being that I've suggested mean that all and only bodies are beings? I'm going to suggest that the answer is yes. Next, and much more difficult, why should this understanding be accepted? And this second question, which I think is far, far harder, there is much more to say than what I'm going to say here today. I'm very happy to discuss it. Nevertheless, I hope to be able to show that at least some progress is already made. Okay, so first, all and only bodies. Reminder, being a body now is roughly being something extended in 3 dimensions with resistance. Resistance is being such as to strike. Being resistant is such as to strike, make an impact, exert pressure, and to do so in response to being affected. And being something with 3D extension, with resistance, includes perhaps being minimally determinate, limited, and bounded. All right. So now, can we go from body to being? Seems yes. By being a body, something will be a being because it will be one, minimally determinate, limited, and bounded. This seems to have to be true of any body. Second, it will be a subject suitable for motion, action, and affection. Bodies are paradigm cases of this, I take it. Third, a stable subject. It will also be a stable subject, at least in some minimal sense, with specific persistence and existence conditions. Now, what about from being to body? It seems to me that here, too, we may succeed, or the Stoics may, because we can say that by being a being, on this understanding that I've suggested, something will be a body because non-bodies are not suitable subjects of motion. They cannot be in motion, at least in their own right. Now, let me just flag here that what I'm relying on here, that non-bodies can't be in motion in their own right, will be controversial. So this would be something that the Stoics would have to defend against opponents. However, I take it as much less controversial that the Stoics themselves would accept it. So it seems that we have, if to be a being is to be a stable, determinate subject suitable for motion, then all and only bodies are beings. So far so good. Now, why this understanding of being? So what I'm going to do here is make some fairly superficial remarks, and I'm going to indicate to you why I think the Stoics have a leg to stand on here. So first, subjecthood and being. I take it that being a subject is not a surprising criterion for being a being. being an ultimate subject is not a surprising criterion for being Lucia. From taking this as criterial for Lucia, it is also a short way, I take it, to taking subjecthood as criterial for being, on the assumption that Lucia is responsible for the being of beings. So there are a number of texts you might bring to mind here. Think of Aristotle's categories, think of Metaphysics Zeta 1 and Zeta 3, about the role of subjecthood and being connected to both Lucia and being a being. Now, of course, this isn't much of an argument. This is just to indicate that to take subjecthood, to be a subject and to be a being, to be intimately connected, is, to my eyes, a very natural move for the Stoics to make. Further, action, affection, motion, and being. And I've given you some of the key references here in note 7. So A, the Stoics hold that action and affection each require motion in the thing acting or being acted on. And they clearly reject the possibility of unmoved movers. And C, and we have seen this already, they insist that a being can act or be acted on. Now, when we put all this together, it makes it quite reasonable for the Stoics to say, at least given the connection between subjecthood and being, that the relevant way of being a subject is to do with being suitable for being in motion. Okay, so the last thing I want to do is just indicate to you how we might try and construct a more substantive and philosophically interesting argument on behalf of the Stoics for the conclusion that no non-body is a being. So we use the following 3 claims that I've called no do-nothings, no unmoved movers, and no moved incorporeals. So no do-nothings. If something is a being, it is able to act. So remember the Plutarch text and the dunamis criterion. No unmoved movers. If something acts, it is moved and in motion. No moved incorporeals. Non-bodies are not suitable subjects of being moved and of being in motion. Now we can argue as follows. If something is a being, it is able to act. If something is able to act, it is able to be in motion. No non-body is able to be in motion, so no non-body is a being. This seems pretty neat. Now, how much better is this than the standard argument? It seems to me at least a little bit. So, bracketing for the moment the claim that there are no moved incorporeals. Now, we don't really know why or on what grounds the Stoics rejected the idea of unmoved movers. However, it seems to me quite likely that it had to do with how they thought of what it takes to be a cause in relation to motion. And so in particular, that if you have an unmoved mover, they might find it difficult to see how the supposed cause actually successfully explains why the effect now obtains in the subject that is in the patient that is being acted on versus not before. That is how this cause is supposed to be a difference maker if there is no difference in the cause itself. Now again, this is speculative, we don't know, but it seems to me to be a pretty Stoic line of thinking. Notably too, somewhat superficially admittedly, the notion of unmoved movers is controversial, and it is not just the Stoics who are inclined to reject it. And of course, this is significant when what we're interested in is whether this is just what we have here for Stoic corporealism is an argument that doesn't really make contact with the thinking of other philosophers. Now, no moved incorporeals. I mean, this is kind of a tough one. I want to first say that this is something, of course, that Aristotle too is very attracted to, which is, I mean, good for my case here because it suggests that by relying on this, the Stoics wouldn't simply be insisting on their own views. They would be insisting on something that has a broader appeal than just to school adherence. Moreover, I would note that even Platonists who wanted to at least finesse this a little bit did so, at least sometimes, in part by insisting that there is a kind of metaphorical way in which at least certain incorporeals are capable of moving. For instance, where the Stoics might not unreasonably insist that this is really not a change in the thing itself, it is actually a change of something else. So we're talking about a mere Cambridge change. Okay, so I'm happy to discuss these last little bits in more detail. I've just indicated some directions, but I think I'll pause there and turn it over to the questions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for this big presentation. Now we have 45 minutes for this question. I think the best way, the easier for everyone wants to raise a question, make a question, I'm sorry. Raise your hands right now and give your number. So please don't write your number. Like 1, 4, 5, 6. That all right. Please go.
Okay, thanks. It's just really a question of clarification about physics. Is this the only piece of evidence which suggests that all four categories were also described as subjects by the Stoics? This doesn't sound very puzzling to me. Like the kind of thing that Buddha say, when you think of it, they're committing to themselves to something like this, and have this multiplication of subjects. But I thought that your argument wanted to say, no, this is actually one of the Stoic position, that although there is something called determinant, which is supposed to be one of the four, all four are determinant at the same time. And I find that puzzling. So I wanted to know whether there is other evidence or any reason not to take the other view that is Buddha foisting upon the Stoics kind of what he thinks is a kind of undesirable consequence or implicit assumption. And the other question, which is connected with this, well, with the question of what the subject is, you put these three kind of criteria for stability, determinacy, and suitability for motion as what identifying something as a subject. In the kind of strategy that you were describing at the beginning of thinking, the Stoics really are reacting to other philosophical conceptions of being. How much is this supposed to be a kind of stipulation, or is it what we think? Because, well, stability for motion, making that a fundamental criteria for subject to and for being, well, this and others say, well, that's exactly the thing that put things more on the side of not being.
Of course.
So would the Stoic have any reason or argument to say, well, when you think of it in a clear way, you must understand that actually motion is really fundamental to being.
Okay, great. So let me just say something first about your first question. Very good question. The T6, this Plutarch bit, is the only text that I've been able to find that explicitly says that the four are kinds of subject. Of course, I agree. We could wonder whether this is genuine. Earlier in the passage, of course, he does say that they say that we are four subjects, using the term hypokeimenon there, and he talks about ousia. I mean, that is a kind of tricky case, and also poion, or maybe idios, idion poion, as a subject too. But this is the best I've been able to find as far as the general claim. Now, I do think that the general claim makes a whole lot of sense given a lot of the other evidence we have. So when we look at the descriptions of what the items are in each of the categories, they seem to be subjects. They seem to be treated as and specified as things that underlie various things, in my view, qualities, skesses, and motions. So I would say that the rest backs it up, even though I agree that we could question this. Yeah. Now, regarding the three features, I mean, it's a little tricky. I don't know how strongly I want to come out here, because to come up with these, I did some digging relying on sort of different texts and putting them together. However, what I will say is that it seems one could defend stability as important for being a being without defending it specifically as the stability needed to be in motion. And so there would be reasons that, Plato and Parmenides and many others too would like favoring stability. And then the Stoics would have their own reasons for saying that, look, okay, we like this, but we think that motion is also really crucial, and that has to do with our way of thinking about causation, movement, explanation, in addition to the dunamis criterion. So that would be the strategy I would propose.
A way of thinking of it is triplet, but there are people who say actually stability and determinacy are the kind of idea of being.
Yeah.
And these are incompatible in a very important sense with motion. Whereas the Stoics want to say motion is somehow part of what makes them stable and determinate. So the question was just an assumption that we think of motion in this very different way as something not only compatible with stability and determinacy, but in a sense necessary.
I mean, the way I've attracted the thinking of it now is that it may look like the significance of motion in this context comes in for the Stoics in connection with the dunamis criterion from the sophist. So we might, I mean, this is a speculative narrative, but it seems to me to be a pretty attractive one, that if we think that the Stoics were really on board with this idea that there are no do-nothings, or no sufferers, right? That if something is to be a being, it needs to have the power to actually be acted on. And now we can think about, well, what does that mean? And for the Stoics, given their thinking, at least if I'm right, about causation and perhaps the need for a difference also in the cause to be able to provide the properly explanatory account of the effect would also need motion. I mean, I think that is probably sort of a key crux between the Stoics and the Platonists. And I think that further evidence of just that is the difficulty with that had by not just Platonists, but also Aristotle, and having causes that are non-bodies and nevertheless, finagle some way in which they are genuinely explanatory as difference makers.
So something you said very early on in the talk was that you didn't think that Stoics had a definition of being a well-known problem. So I was wondering if you could just say a bit more about why you think that the Stoics specifically define the problem. Because of course I can see why there'll be a problem defining being. Say you think being is said in many ways, or you think being is the highest genus. But with the Stoic structure, it looks as if you have a recipe. You have a higher genus.
It's true.
And so, I mean, I was also noticed in passing that T4, Plotinus seems to think that Plotinus seems to think a bit about that strategy of defining being as a kind of something, be differentiated from other kinds. Presumably you could say something like, well, it's a something that's a subject, as opposed to something that's not a subject.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, partly, actually, I was wondering, so Plotinus seems to think they couldn't do that. He says they have left no difference by which they can divide. I was wondering what he means, why he might think that. And in general, why, so, and then more generally, yes, so, why do you think they, why would that?
So I don't actually want to just say that they couldn't, and I will back off from the suggestion that I might have wanted to say that earlier. I do think so, and of course I do agree precisely that given the seeming relationship between on and t, it would be an easier job for the Stoics to do so. And so maybe they did. We have no evidence of that. And in fact, I mean, what I've been able to come up with here is really like pulling stuff together from a lot of different texts. I mean, that's only an argument from silence. It's pretty weak. I do also just want to say that it is not clear to me how easy it would be, even if there is a kind of higher genus, to define being. In part because it isn't completely obvious to me that how one might go about clearly distinguishing the relevant kind of determinacy in each case. I mean, partly this is a difficulty having to do with what it is to be something. But I mean, that was roughly the kind of thing I had in mind.
Okay, also one thing I'm wondering, presumably at least there's some
In your view, you at least succeed in getting an extension out of the script moments, also wonder whether it's kind of, and there might be other considerations for things.
Yes, it's true. So, I mean, partly this is a kind of move of caution on my part, because there really is no evidence that was a definition of being. Of course, if one is really convinced of the story that I've given here, one could try to say, well, look, isn't it pretty good to say that to be a being is to be a stable, determinate subject suitable for motion? Couldn't we then say that beings are some things that are just that? Well, maybe we could. I hesitate to do so, just given the sheer amount of uncertainty in this area. Yeah.
Number 3.
Opportunity. Thank you. I really enjoyed the paper, and it touched upon lots of things I'm interested in. So I've remarks that at one point I think goes towards supporting what you're saying. So what's it that the Stoics were responding to when both endorsing the principle is that we be capable of causing or suffering change, and were they trying to isolate the type of possession that they wanted to endorse, excluding another type of possession that principle would cover as well. Mm-hmm. And your suggestion there, well, maybe they are trying to prevent that something like a mover would be a cause. So I find that really interesting. I want to give you a suggestion that enlarges, I think, the import of what you're saying. So I recently read the Sophist, and here I can send you this reference, 247 and thereabouts. Plato is talking about, just before talking about the principle that is to be a dunamis, I think he's differentiating two. He's saying we need to find something common between causes that are bodily causes and causes that are not bodily causes. And the one way to be a cause is to be a difference maker, in my terminology, and the other is to bring about suffer change. And now the Stoics would be endorsing only one side of it, namely to be able to cause or suffer change, excluding the other side, the other difference-making type of possession, which I think applies not just to the mover, but to obviously Platonic forms, but also causes of the pre-Socratic minds, like even Anaxagorean causal powers, and some the opposite. So, you know, what I'm saying here is that I'd like to talk to you more about this.
Yeah.
But I think there is the Sophist, I think, just before that, the principle is that gives evidence that there were two branches of ways of thinking about position better before, and the Stoics will be responding to one. So, supporting.
No, that's great. Thank you.
But yeah, can I, as being Trinity, can I make other quick remarks? I was intrigued by something you said, which was slightly also different from the handout. So I wonder what you think. Do you think that being a refined subjectus as being makes sense for the Stoics, or makes sense philosophically more broadly, say in antiquity?
Both.
Okay, then I worry about it, because I think the Stoics might make sense. But for someone like Aristotle, that reifying the subject would generate a problem with the unity of substance, because then you have the subject plus the property, you don't have one thing.
Oh, I mean, I agree. I'm not saying it's unproblematic, but I do think that, I mean, precisely what you're pointing to there, I mean, some of the difficulties that come out in Metaphysics Zeta and so on, and Ada and elsewhere, are problems that in part come about because of the seeming attractiveness of the subject.
That others don't endorse, but the Stoics endorse?
No, but I mean, for Aristotle, I mean, in well-known bits in Metaphysics Zeta, for instance, and also in, what is it, Delta 7, we get the apparent idea that even the form is a tautology and a hypokemenon in Zeta. And I mean, even though Aristotle wants to back off from the kind of extreme view that he explores problematically in Metaphysics Zeta 3, he does seem to want to retain this idea that subjecthood is very important for ousiahood.
Okay. You know, I had similar thoughts a long while ago, but I think now I have a revisionary reading of this stuff, so we can leave it at that. Third quick remark is that it's just information. So Vanessa has a paper on Stoic prime matter in progress, and maybe you know already about this, but to be an interesting person between.
Okay, good.
So yeah.
Thank you very much. Great. Yeah. Thanks very much, Bryan. Very, very enjoyable, very interesting paper. Yeah, I'm also I'm glad you mentioned the sophist because, so I was thinking about the friends of the forms, right? So they get into trouble because they don't allow the right sort of change into what they say are beings.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I'm asking kind of like a flat-footed question, which is like, can't incorporeals suffer motion? So, like the meta arguments that we were talking about yesterday, maybe arguably you could say that the proposition could, change in changing truth value, and moreover, maybe a predicate changes relatively insofar as it's an object of an impulse, or maybe a predicate changes insofar as it's composed with the case. So there's sort of a flat-footed question, right? Isn't there, on your two, being a subject suitable for motion, action, and affection, isn't there a sense in which the Stoics do want to say that non-beings suffer change?
I want to distinguish two questions. One that I think is considerably harder. I do think that with respect to the question of whether the Stoics would allow incorporeals to be in motion, and can I say, I think the answer must be a firm no. And that, of course, there are all these cases. I'm not going to quibble about that. However, I would be inclined to think that those would have to be explained in some other way. As either metaphorical, if we ever literally get the claim that an incorporeal is in motion, which I can't recall ever seeing. It must, there are sort of general principles about causation for the Stoics that rule it out, having to do with how motion always needs to have a cause, and that in order to, if motions, as I think, and many others, as effects are incorporeals, there also needs to be a corporeal patient that is acted on such that it belongs to it. So for that, I would say that there would have to be some kind of metaphorical story, or some kind of story that this is in motion, but that doesn't mean that there can't be differences. The much harder question, I think, is forget about the Stoics' own commitments and how they can solve this. What about the more general question? Why can't incorporeals be in motion? It's a very hard question. So I have some thoughts about it. First, I think, and I should start by saying that I don't have a sort of knockdown argument on behalf of the Stoics here. It's all a matter of coming up with considerations that put sort of more pressure, I think. And it also seems to me significant that even among Platonists, there seemed to be a bit of sort of unease about endorsing straight up the claim that something incorporeal, like, a form or a soul, is literally in motion. Even though, we do get things in this direction. Now, here are some things, and some of this might sound kind of Aristotelian. Suppose that an incorporeal is in motion. In what kind of motion would it be? Presumably, it isn't literally generated or destroyed. If it is, the Stoics could, perhaps this could be denied, but still, it's an interesting thought. That, well, then there would have to be something out of which or from which it's generated or destroyed. Now, this would be something that the Stoics, and Aristotle too, of course, would link to matter. And now we are in trouble, right? Could it be locomotion? It seems unattractive to say so. Could it be a qualitative change? Maybe, though not in a paradigmatic way, I take it. So I think I'll leave it at that. And what do you think?
No, I think it's a tough question. I just think in the context of the sophists, people think that, on the friends of the form side, maybe there's a notion of relative change, right? Like, so being known is a sort of relational Cambridge change, and maybe not a change at all. Maybe that's, too weak to count as a genuine change. I think that's some suggestions.
Well,
in these sort of incorporeals, we could have to sort of explore that strategy. Maybe
they're independently existing or subsisting, independently subsisting, they're mind independent, but maybe they can engage in relative changes. Thought about, being the object of an impulse, or all the other cases where they seem to say that incorporeals change.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, and I also suspect that, and I'm inclined to be sympathetic to the Stoics on this, to say that, well, fair enough, but is that really a change in the thing?
Right.
Surely not. It's a change in something else by the corresponding difference in this thing that we metaphorically or in some extended sense may talk about motion. I mean, that seems to me to be a fairly promising strategy anyway. Yeah.
So I think I have a worry that's sort of a generalization or expansion of Simon's worry. And so I take it part of the sort of motivation for the paper is to say something like, well, we usually account for being in terms of body, and we're saying, like, what is it to be a being is to be a body. That's kind of uninformative and motivated. We need to have a longer story. And so the longer story is, well, being is being a subject, and that needs refining, because being a subject is not enough, because incorporeals are also subjects. So it's really being a certain kind of subject. And then you say, well, it's being a kind of subject in these different ways. And I worry that all of these different ways kind of amount to being a subject as a body, like being a bodily subject. And I worry about that because it does seem to me as though most of those apply in some form or other to incorporeals. And the way that they don't is that you need to sort of add in a bodily sort of way. So here's an example. You want to say, well, you need to be determinate, but you've said yourself that you take incorporeals to be the subject of deixis, and being the subject of deixis requires them to be determinate. So being determinate isn't enough. So what kind of determinacy is at play here? It's being bounded. So it's being determinate in a body kind of way. So actually, the determinacy is not the thing that's really relevant. The thing that's relevant is that it's a body. Motion, well, you might say, a way to sort of cheapen the answer that you just gave to Simon, and I'm kind of inclined to think that you have an answer to that, but it's to say, well, what kind of motion is the kind of subject that we're interested in here? The subject of, well, the subject of bodily motion, as opposed to, and same with stability, right? So I would think that in some way incorporeals are stable. At least that seems like plausible to me. So how are they differently stable? Well, they're incorporeally stable and not bodily stable. And I wonder if one maybe promising thing that came out in your answer to Simon is actually the relevant thing is dependence here. So you have independence in your stability point. Maybe they're suitable for motion independently, or for independent change as opposed to incorporeals. I'm not sure how that works for determinacy, but maybe there's something that you can do there. But anyway, that's a sort of general worry for. That is, I'm convinced by everything you say. I'm just not sure that it's that much more informative than just saying being is a body.
Yeah. Now, let me just start by saying that it's an interesting question to me how much of a difference we should seek. Now, it looks to me that even if the two are closely connected, and even on the picture I presented today, they are extremely closely connected, right? They're connected by this biconditional. Part of why I'm keen that I really don't want to say that to be a being is to be a body, or is that the stuff having to do with being is couched in much more kind of ontological terms. And the stuff about ousia, for instance, seems to me to be highly significant in ways that aren't always appreciated when people write about it in connection with prime matter, for instance. And when we get a claim like, well, prime matter is ousia of all beings, I mean, that is a sort of big claim that anyone in the context who read the Stoics would understand as, ousia is really doing the work here. So that was just the preamble. Now, to the objection, I am inclined to think that to really push this case on the behalf of the Stoics, we should have a kind of subscript kathauto for each of these features. And so that the independence is really crucial. And I mean, I briefly hinted at this. So when we look at determinacy, there is a certain type of determinacy that belongs to bodies, namely that they are limited, they are bounded in space or place. Now, the Stoics also think, we know, right, from texts about topos and even about Kenon, that these incorporeals too can be bounded, but not in their own right. They inherit the boundaries of bodies. Now, there is a sort of trick here that you pointed to, Marian, which is that it's not clear that we're talking about just the same determinacy. And we shouldn't, right, if there is a determinacy that has to do with being something, which I think there is. Now, so one thing I would say then is that there ought to be a sense in which bodies are determined in some way in their own right, which is distinctive to them. Now, that way of being determined in their own right shouldn't belong just generally to incorporeals, and I think the stuff about limits is arguably evidence of that. There should be a more general sense of determinacy which applies to all tinna, but that's fine. Now, stability. There too, just as you said, I would say that, well, it isn't merely being stable, it is being independently stable in some way. Moreover, I mean, I do agree that motion is probably the thing that is doing the most work here. And to some extent, I think that's a happy result because it aligns very well with this idea that the Stoics are keen on the dunamis criterion of being. And so that this is partly why I wanted to insist that being a stable subject, being a stable determinate subject suitable for motion is to be taken as a kind of unit, is that it's all meant to go together as a single way of being that only belongs to bodies. And so the being suitable for motion and so being linked to being able to do things and to suffer things is bound up with the way in which these subjects are both stable and determinate. That's the thought anyway. It seems to me that that is notionally interestingly different from being a body. Of course, I don't know how much we should expect of a Stoic argument here, because we could imagine something like this. Given that we have some fairly significant philosophical reasons for thinking of being in this way, look, what about bodies? They seem to be perfect examples of things that fit this and so ought to be being. What about other things? Well, there seem to be fairly good reasons to be worried about a lot of other things in this regard. Should we expect a sort of fully explicit knockdown argument that nothing else could possibly? I waffle a little bit on that.
Yes, thank you, Reier. Well, I have two questions. Well, you argue that all beings are bodies, and that's true. And all the evidence indicates that to explain that all beings are bodies, and that all bodies are beings, I suppose. But the important point here is that there are incorporeal, and so that's that, and all the evidence shows that. So the question you ask is why? Why all the bodies? And well, that we don't have clear answer in the sources. But what you suggest is that, among other things, is that being a being, or all beings, are three things. They are minimally determinate, subject of motion, and three, a stable subject with specific. Right, and then you suggest that only bodies satisfy this. Now, some of the questions that were already challenge, some aspects of this claim. Mm-hmm. But I would like to return to this claim and give, I hope, some examples. For example, well, more than counter examples, I have some questions. What do you mean by minimally determinate? down. It's what, because these are two things, things I think, not being limited is just having a limit, something that encloses thing and so, but that means you can have incorporeal limited places. This place, this room is enclosed by 4 walls, glass, so that's limited. And you can also think of a period of time as limited. For example, the duration of the day. However long or short it is, it's always limited by minutes. It's not limited. And so time, no? Periods of time. Not just the events that happen in time are limited, but the period itself.
Yep.
And so this I mean, would these be counter examples to limitedness? And then for determinacy, what do you mean by determinate? Because a Platonist could say that forms are determinate, and they are even self-predictive, and self-predictive. That one in the form is self-predictive. And there are things that forms are and things that they aren't. So they are, in a way, they are determinate. But clearly they are bodies. So that's for the first condition. For the second condition, well, you say that they have that only bodies are subject to motion. Well, the example given by Simon, no, I think they are good examples, and your answer was that, well, these are metaphorical, that in reality the propositions or states change. Well, maybe, but still they use this vocabulary of change to characterize the position. So an argument would be needed to show that is metaphorical. I mean, so and let me give you another example. Time. The Stoics think. Some of the evidence, not all of it, but some of the evidence suggests that for the Stoics, time is a change, it's a flow, it's a pace here, direct terminology. For example, I was looking at this passage. It's Plutarch in 10:1d. He says they posit that there is a present time. Of which one part was present yesterday, and one part will be present, and present time, not that it's future. So this suggests that for the Stoics time changes. It was something, no longer is, and it will be. So that's a change, And so time would be a change. And so that would be a kind of example to the second condition. And another worry I have with second condition is that second condition, well, let's suppose that only bodies are a subject for motion. But why say that this is the criterion for being, rather than being a subject? If you say, well, no, it cannot be something as general as education, be something more specific. I mean, aren't you making the question and say, well, only bodies are beings because one condition for being a being is being the kind of subject that all bodies are. So I know. I mean, it would be. In what sense this is not? I would say that. well, in order to be a being, you have to be a subject of verification, but then, of course, incorporeals are subject to verification. And there is this strange claim that we find only once, as far as I know. This is that it's a passage from Simplicius. It's in Romanes 28L. Well, they say that the Stoics say that the qualities of the bodies are corporeal, and those of the corporeals incorporeal. So qualities, so incorporeal have qualities too, and so they are subject to qualities. True, this is very strange, and as far as I know, there is one. But well, I mean, if you give any weight to this idea, then incorporeals would be subject of verification of qualities, not just of verification in general, but quality.
Okay, so first, regarding the different conditions and the potential counterexample, I don't mean to deny that these conditions couldn't be argued individually, perhaps, to belong to other things than bodies or beings. This is why, but I don't intend them to be taken separately. I mean, this is the key reason why I insist that this is one way of being a subject that combines all of them together. And in addition, just referring back to some of my remarks in response to Marian, that a key reason too seems to have to do with independence and being such in one's own right. Now, concerning your remarks about incorporeals that may be in motion. So I take it that literally to say for a Stoic that an incorporeal is in motion is inconsistent with very well attested views about causation. So in particular, every motion has a cause. I mean, this is attested in multiple texts, among others in Alexander. I think it's De Fato when he talks about this, but there are many others, including in Simplicius too. If it needs to have a cause, then the idea, I take it, is that if something is in motion, it is a thing that is acted on by a body, the effect of which, interaction, is the motion. And if that's the right way to think of it, then it cannot be that an incorporeal is literally in motion, because it cannot be acted on. It isn't an appropriate patient. So, and as a result, I would be inclined to say that any case where, and I'm not going to deny that there aren't cases that may seem to go in this direction, they can't be meant literally in the same way. That an incorporeal isn't literally in motion in the sense that it is a subject to which emotion belongs. That's what I would say about that. And it seems to me to be very hard going to reject that we would have to jettison or otherwise reinterpret large swathes of what I take to be sort of very solid bits of Stoic thinking about causation. Now,
he's in motion, but he's a body, right?
Yes.
But he's in motion. But what would be the cause of God's motion? He has always been in motion.
God.
God. Yeah, well, himself. No?
Yes.
Himself was the...
I mean, that's what I think. Yeah. I mean, I tried to set this out how I think of this in my paper, which you know, but that's how I would address that case. So the Simplicius passage, the long and subtly 28L, I mean, a weird passage. Yes. So here's how I'm inclined to think of it. Given the relatively abundant evidence that qualities are causes and as such bodies, if we are to take Simplicius here, his report as solid, I would be inclined to say that the sense in which the something of incorporeals are qualities will be a different sense of quality. And so my move would then be to say that I would then just go more specific and say that the relevant, the subject to that issue here is to be a subject for the qualities for a body. Of course, this would raise further questions, of course.
I mean, it would have to be a different, they would have to be qualities in a different sense of qualities, or they would have to be different qualities.
No, I mean different sense. Like, I mean, so in the case of bodies, there are lots of texts that say that a quality apoiotes is a cause and a body. I take it that that can't be the quality of an incorporeal. Except perhaps if you take some kind of, I mean, you could try to construct some kind of extension story and say that, oh, this corporeal quality is a quality of this incorporeal, but only indirectly by way of a relation to a body. I mean, you could say that.
Of course,
yeah.
Of course. They would have to be different qualities. That's certain. No, I mean, incorporeal wouldn't be able to have a corporeal quality. Like, of course. But the idea here is that there are incorporeal qualities.
Yes.
Which are qualities of incorporeal. No? And so you could say that there are qualities, some corporeal, but they are all qualities in the same sense of quality. They are properties of things. And this takes us to the question, why not something more general for the second position, like subject of the, well, I mean, what aren't by saying that, well, the kind of subject that we need is this kind of subject, which happens to be the kind of subject that bodies have. But then you are supposing the conclusion.
Well, I want to distinguish between two things that I'm doing here. So one thing that I'm doing is trying to come up with an informative answer about what it is to be a being that gets the extension right for the Stoics. Now, so that I would say, when we're just talking about what it might be within the Stoic system, isn't question begging, because the Stoics, of course, don't think that beings that a subject, because being a subject of predication is more general than for beings, right? Is more general, like it applies to incorporeals too. So it would get the extension wrong. So that's one thing. I would also just add there that, in fact, when we look at the evidence, we don't find that beings are characterized as subjects of predication. We do really seem to find something considerably more specific. And I've tried to indicate that by having these specifically corporeal features. But secondly, of course, you are right that when it comes to the question, well, how might the Stoics defend this way of thinking about being? There, the threat is much more severe. I completely agree. And there, my attempt has been to say that this comes out of two things, primarily, which is one, the Stoic sympathy with the idea that beings are doers and sufferers. So the dunamis principle, combined with a certain way of thinking about what something needs to be like in order to be like that. Now, there seems to me to be a philosophically very interesting and to some extent substantive gap that makes this difference interesting and important, and not just as if to say that, well, only bodies can do that.
No, I agree that only bodies are beings. All beings are proven. I was just trying to think about the reasons, no, for it.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you very much. We have one more question. Please, very brief. We have 5 minutes.
Yeah. Thanks for the great talk. I just wanted to ask you something about subject to the being, right? Because I mean, you say that there is that you don't find surprising that being a subject is not surprising for being a being, right? But I mean, being a subject seems to be a criterion for being a particular kind of being, right? For being a substance, right? Not for being
any being or a being or that which makes any being a being, right? This is precisely what Aristotle says that substance said in many ways, at least in four. One of these is the subject. That's what Paul said, right? So that's what I find a bit possible, right? So I would say that I do find it surprising that being a subject is big.
Good. So there are two things I want to say. Actually three, but the first one is not that interesting. So I made a longer story very short, just to indicate how I might want to go here. But secondly, so while you're right about Aristotle in Metaphysics Zeta 3, if we look at Zeta 1, for instance, there seems to be also a slightly more general idea at play having to do with some things having a better claim to being a being by being a more determinate subject. Now, secondly, it seems to me pretty plausible also to connect the claim about ousia to the claim about being. And I mean, that was what I was trying to hint at with this remark, that from taking being an ultimate subject as criterial for ousia, it's a short way to taking subjecthood as criterial for being, on the assumption that ousia is responsible for the being of being. So the idea would be, do you see what I mean?
Yeah. What I mean. Ousia is a principle of being, because it makes all the things that are not ousia being. Right? But in this picture, that ousia is not a principle of all the things that are not ousia. I mean, in the sense that, principle that makes them be beings in a sense. Right?
I have a longer story about this, but so the way I think that for the Stoics, they make two claims about prime matter. First is, it is ousia, full stop. It is also ousia of all beings. Now, what does that second claim mean for the Stoics? Here's what I take to be a very plausible kind of minimal answer. It is responsible somehow for other beings merely being beings. So, for instance, it is prime matter that is responsible for any particular being. It is responsible for that being's being a being. For the Stoics, that is going to be the rest of that story. So if you take Socrates, for instance, Socrates is a qualified subject. And prime matter isn't responsible for Socrates being that particular kind of being. But prime matter is what, by supplying some corporeal stuff, accounts for the possibility of Socrates being a being of any sort whatsoever. And it's the active principle that comes in and is responsible for the qualification and the specific type of being that Socrates is. That's how I would flesh out that story.
Finally, in relation to Lucas' question, what does applustron means in text 6, right? Because Plutarch says, I'm going to make their logos applustron. Right? So that's why they say that they are form subjects. Plausible interpretation is that he's going to give an account that is not such an account, because it's a simpler account in which the categories are no longer categories of being in any way, because they are just kinds of subjects, right? So being a being is being a subject. So there are no categories anymore. All the categories are just kinds of being a subject, right? No different kinds of being. For one is being a subject, another is being a quality, so on.
Yeah.
So I think that maybe what Plutarch is suggesting.
I don't think that's right. So the applustron, I think what's going on, and I think this is also a relatively common view, is that he's simplifying by just mentioning two types of subject in the first case at hand. Whereas the Stoic view actually has to do with all four categories. This is a Stephen Menn line in the 99 paper, and I'm inclined to think that's right. There is otherwise, when we look at the first bit when Plutarch talks about two subjects versus when he says, oh, actually they make all of us four, there seems to be no other substantive difference in doctrine than the counting, so to speak. So that would be my minimal explanation of what's going on with that. Otherwise, with regard to the alternative way of reading this passage, I would say that it looks to me that what Plutarch says here at the end about the categories giving us kinds of subject, in fact, goes just very nicely with what we get in Simplicius and Plotinus. I'm not saying it's necessary. Very little here is. Just scraps, right? But it seems to go pretty nicely, not only with literally what what Plotinus and Simplicius tell us, but also what we in fact get when we look at the categories. I mean, they seem to be subjects of different kinds. So that would be my response. Thanks.
Very much.